how do you keep your brush pen from fraying? Is smooth paper really the answer? In this video, let me share with you 5 ways to avoid fraying your brush pens. Take a look at the difference between the new brush pen on the top and the frayed brush pen on the bottom. The frayed one doesn't give thin upstrokes and clean edges. The frayed one feels like lettering with a floppy fish. It's not bouncing back into place like it should. The new one has nice thin upstrokes and easy transitions. I have been hand lettering since 2016, and when I started, I was using cheap, rough paper and I frayed lots of brush pens. Because of that, I became a stickler on only using the nicest, smoothest paper for my brush pens. Well, in the last year or so, I've changed my mind about smooth paper, and it might surprise you. I no longer think that smooth paper is the most important thing, and don't worry, we're going to get into all of that. Number 1, don't use them at all. Okay, I'm kidding. Sort of. But yeah, it is true that if your goal is to keep your pens from fraying, you probably shouldn't be using them. Well, clearly that's not the goal, right? The goal is to have a creative outlet and make something that feels like your best self, which means we will be using the pens. Unfortunately, felt tip brush pens will eventually fray over time. All we can do is extend their non-frayed life. And at this point, if you're asking, why do we care if they fray? We are mostly concerned about a frayed brush pen when it comes to hand lettering and calligraphy. If you are using your brush pens for coloring or making backgrounds, it's not going to matter as much if they're frayed. With hand lettering, a frayed brush pen is working against you instead of working with you to achieve that beautiful lettering that you crave. Nobody wants to hand letter with a floppy fish. That is not helpful. And that brings me to actual number 1. Years ago, I shared a video when I tried the cheapest brush markers that I could find, and they were basically frayed on the first use, even on smooth paper. It had nothing to do with the paper or the way I was using them. They're just cheap and poor quality. Compare that with Caron markers that are a lot more expensive, but I've had some of these since 2018 and most of them are not frayed. There are a few colors that are definitely not as firm as when they were brand new, but I've been using them on all types of paper, including rough watercolor paper, and that's why number 1 is choose good quality brush pens. In my opinion, the quality of pens is more important than the smoothness of the paper. Simply by choosing higher quality, it might actually save you money in the long run. And finding pens that help you feel like your best self might be worth the cost, but you will have to make that decision for yourself. Also, you may want to try small brush pens like the Pentel Sign brush pens. They don't fray in the same way that large brush pens do. They may wear down a little, but I've had some of these since maybe around 2017 and they're still doing great. I've even used them on watercolor paper. I know it's super overwhelming to know which pens are good quality. I have tried so many pens, so I made a video for you so you know which ones are good without trying all the ones that I have tried. The video is linked in the description below. Moving on to number 2. Years ago, I was teaching my dear neighbor how to hand letter. She kept doing the oval like this with what I call a soggy bottom instead of a clean transition from thick to thin. I kept trying to tell her how to fix it, but we couldn't figure out why she couldn't get it. And then I realized this tiny detail that we changed, and her letters magically looked better. So listen carefully. This trick can improve your lettering drastically, and it's so easy. Hold the pen perpendicular to the downstroke. Instead of turned like this, just turn it up perpendicular to the downstroke. If you're left-handed, it's the same, just on the other side. My neighbor was holding her pen at this angle, and the brush pen had to drag around, and there was no chance she wouldn't get a soggy bottom. But simply moving your pen up here like this, now your pen will work with you. So that's the number 2 to keep your pen from fraying. Hold your pen correctly. If you hold your pen straight up and down, you will be bending the tip too much and it can wear out faster. But when you hold it at a 45-degree angle and perpendicular to the downstroke, that's the best angle for your brush tip and to get beautiful lettering. Those are the most helpful tips and they can change your lettering today. And in my book, Hand Lettering for Beginners, there's even more tips on how to hold your pen, how to practice, how to get beautiful lettering. Next is number 3. When I first started lettering, I learned that you can do calligraphy with a brush pen by drawing in your thick downstrokes manually. So I started lettering anytime I was holding a pen or pencil. If you are worried about fraying your brush pens, you'll love this one. Number 3, do faux calligraphy. All you do is letter your word and then go back in and thicken up all of the downstrokes wherever your pen went down. You can do this on any paper and with any pen in any size. And because you can do any size, you can get really large lettering, really small lettering, because you get to choose the thickness of the downstrokes instead of relying on the width of the brush tip. I love using my glass pen to do faux calligraphy. And before you say, well, you're not doing real calligraphy, just remember that your hand lettering and calligraphy doesn't have to look like anyone else's. The supplies you use will be just as unique as you are. Use the things that light you up and make you feel good. Hand lettering should feel like your best self. It's not going to feel like you if you're only using the supplies that someone else says you have to use. Give yourself room to explore your own creativity. Number 4 goes right along with that. When I first started hand lettering, I was a high school teacher, and in my classroom, I had a whole bucket of Crayola markers. So that's what I started hand lettering with. They're not brush pens, so they won't fray, but they work really well for calligraphy because the squishy tip is flexible, so you can get thick and thin strokes. So number 4, use markers that don't fray. I have a whole video about markers that are like Crayola markers that work for hand lettering, and I will link that below. You can use them on any paper, and they're generally cheaper than brush pens, so it's a win-win. It's a great budget-friendly way to start hand lettering. I love Crayola markers just as much now as I did when I first started hand lettering. I also love Staedtler Tri Plus highlighters. Someone told me these could be used for hand lettering and I didn't believe them, and now they are some of my very favorite. So if you haven't used these, try them and tell me what you think. And for number 5, we do need to talk about smooth paper. For years, I've taught that the way to avoid fraying your brush pens is to use smooth paper. Unfortunately, that's the thing that kept me from starting a hand lettering journal or a sketchbook because I was so afraid of using the wrong paper and fraying my brush pens. And you know what? I still had some brush pens fray, even while being so rigid about using smooth paper. So yes, paper does matter. Be intentional about the paper you use, but don't let it hold you back. Instead, number 5, choose the paper to match the thing that you're trying to create. What I mean by that is if you want to do some blending, you aren't going to be able to do that on printer paper. You'll need Bristol smooth paper. When you're just starting out and you're practicing a lot, smooth paper can really help so that your pen is not getting stuck on the rough paper. So you may want to use tracing paper to practice. If you want really smooth lettering, the rough texture of watercolor paper is not going to do that for you. If you love the textured look, use your pens on rough watercolor paper. It's really okay. I do have a video with my favorite smooth paper if you're wondering about that, and I'll link that below. But if you want to start a sketchbook or a journal, use your brush pens in the kind of journal that makes you feel fancy. For example, I love Archer and Olive journals. The paper is high quality and really thick, but it's not as smooth as the buttery soft Rhodia notepad. However, I like the binding and the feel of the Archer and Olive as a journal, so use the paper that makes you want to create. Maybe that is smooth paper for you, but maybe it's not. Don't let the paper type or even pen type stop you from simply creating. Create with what you have right now as you're working towards something more. Like I said at the beginning, I changed my mind about smooth paper. Now my opinion is to use the pens on whatever paper you have. Use them up. That's what they're made for. Create as much as you can because you are a creative person and you want to get that creativity out on paper. That is how you're going to make hand lettering that feels like your best self, simply by creating over and over and over again. And pens help you do that. So use your pens up to the very last drop, because it makes you feel good to create. Now, if you're ready to create, but you need some ideas, check out this video right here, and I will see you there.